So welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about two important principles of design that are interconnected, and that is scale and proportion. And the reason that these are connected together is because they are both describing kind of spatial relationships. So as we delve in today, we're going to be taking a look at making sure that we understand how these two terms are similar but also a little bit different. And as we sort of extend your learning past this video, the idea here is that you're going to be able to use these concepts of scale and proportion in order to be able to deliberately create your artwork. Now, I'm using the word deliberate here because sometimes you're going to want to maintain scale, and sometimes you're going to want to distort scale, and same thing with proportion. Once we know the rules of scale and proportion, then we're able to break them or manipulate them in order to create additional meaning in your work. And lastly, as we're going through this process, hopefully you are developing a sense of how proportion specifically is going to be able to help create a sense of space and also to help to develop a sense of visual accuracy in your work. Okay, so scale. Basically, scale means the size of an artwork, right? And we have a variety of different terms that we can use in order to help describe the scale of various pieces, okay, such as this miniature altarpiece, right, which although it might look large in the photograph, if you look down in the dimensions below the image, right, this is only 15 centimeters by 13 centimeters wide, and it's only 3 centimeters deep. This is an incredibly small, yet highly detailed and sophisticated visual artifact that we have here from the 1500s. Okay, so we have different terms such as minuscule, tiny, small, medium, average, big, large, huge, gigantic, monumental, right? You could even say something is gargantuan, right? We have these terms to describe the size of the things that we can observe, right? We can also talk about how we manipulate size, right? And in this case, we see Jeff Koons' balloon dog sculptures. And when we think of balloon animals, right, they're handheld objects that we often get at parties or at carnivals. But here we see the process of enlargement, right? We take something that is small and we make it bigger, right? So we can enlarge something, but we can also magnify something, right? So something that goes under a microscope, we can see something that is not visible to the human eye. Right, and on the opposite side, we have that idea of minification or making something miniature and reducing the object's size or scale in order to kind of make it fit in your pocket, so to speak. Okay. So once we have this understanding of size kind of figured out, then we need to start thinking about concepts of proportion. And proportion is all about relationships, right? When we say something is proportionate, we mean that object X needs to be the right size in relationship to object Y, right? Basically we're establishing various ratios, right? So this image of Da Vinci's called Vitruvian Man, right, starts breaking down the proportions of the human form and how different parts of the human body are in proportion to each other. So for example, the width of the arms, right, in relationship to the length of the legs and the torso, right, the distance between the hips and the knees and the feet. All right, so when we're thinking about proportion, we're thinking about how different parts of a whole can relate to each other, or we can talk about how different objects relate to each other in terms of their overall size. All right, we also can talk about facial proportions, right? And here we see a scientific study actually of the ratios that exist within an African Caribbean face in order to sort of come up with the idea of what is beautiful. The ideal is a extension of this idea of proportions in that we're kind of able to mathematically come up with those ratios in order to help us be able to draw more accurately, right? So what we're seeing in this particular image is the ratio of horizontal kind of measurements versus vertical measurements within the human face, right? And one thing that's kind of curious to note here and important to note is that different racial backgrounds have different kind of proportion setups within the face in order to kind of create that sense of visual balance and idealization, right? But the ratios are quite consistent within the face overall. Right? One way of looking at proportion is through the golden ratio, and this is something that was discovered in the Renaissance. And basically, what we're doing here is saying that, this total if we have the height of something as A, and the width of that should be A plus B, right, in order to help create that sense of overall balance. So there's mathematical explorations of this as well. And we also see this when it comes to the idea of the Fibonacci sequence as a unique set of numbers that are kind of proportionately increasing based on not an overly complex mathematical formula, but a formula nonetheless. And when we transfer that formula into a graphical representation, artists have discovered that we get a visual phenomenon that looks kind of like this. So down in the center, right, we can see the beginning of the sequence. We start with 1, and then 1 plus 0, right, the number that came before is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, 8 plus 5 is 13, 13 plus 8 is 21, right? And you can see that this spiral begins to emerge. And what is really interesting about this mathematical relationship in this ratio is that it appears all over nature, in sunflowers, in various plants, in shells, and even in pine cones as well. Right? So there's a sense that these proportions are quite significant, but because not only are we able to locate them in the natural world, but we're able to come up with a mathematical way of representing these proportions as well. All right, so when we transfer that basic concept into visual artworks, right, we can see that this can get overlaid over the Mona Lisa in terms of the positioning and overall structure of her face and torso, right? But even looking at artworks such as Yasumasa Morimura's, one of his, The Great Wave, which is part of his Mount Fuji series, right? We can see the same principle being applied, right? So we have size, right? And we have proportion. And when we work with both of them together and we think about how we can either use the rules of proportion or manipulate those rules of proportion and scale, then we're able to create some fairly interesting images. Hopefully this gives you something to think about as you move forward in the creation of your own work. And if you have any further questions, make sure that you're asking. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.